We had a saying in the VEth, Compact Military Intelligence Division. If you can count its wounds, it isn't finished. I thought it was poetry, motivational noise, the kind of, thing you carve into a wall and never actually believe. Then we caught a human, not found one, not in my opinion, made first contact with one, caught one, restrained, sedated, locked behind 6 centimeters of reinforced containment plating with a biometric lock that required 2 officers to open. We treated it like a weapon because that's what the briefing said it was. Bipedal combatant, plus Class 7 threat designation, handle with extreme caution. The briefing did not say what to do when the weapon started whistling. Not a signal, not a distress call our systems could pass. Just sound, rhythmic, plus almost pleasant. Coming from behind the containment door at 0300 ship standard, quiet enough that I only caught it because I was on log duty and the corridor acoustics are terrible on VEth Dominion class carriers. I stood outside that door for 11 minutes. I told myself, in my opinion, I was assessing. Plus, what I was actually doing was listening. That was my first mistake. There would be others. I documented all of them. I timestamp everything. It's a compulsion my commanding officer finds irritating. I find non-negotiable. And looking back at that log now, from the other side of everything that happened, I can see exactly where I went wrong. I went wrong, basically, the moment I assumed caught meant contained. I went wrong the moment I assumed the thing behind that door was afraid of us. It wasn't. It was waiting. The human had been in containment for 9 hours when it asked me for something to write with. Not through a translator, not through tapping code on the walls. It pressed its face close to the containment viewport. That flat, oddly symmetrical face, nose slightly off-center from what I assume was an old injury, a thin scar running through its left eyebrow. And it held up 2 fingers and made a scratching motion in the air. I logged the gesture. I logged the time, which I stood very still and said nothing. It did it again. Plus, patient, almost bored. I reported it to Sub-Commander Veyes, who told me to note it and move on, because a prisoner requesting writing users wasn't a tactical concern. This is the kind of thing Veyes says. It is also the kind of thing that, in retrospect, it tells you exactly how badly we had miscalculated. I gave it basically a stylus and a data slate with no network access. Stripped firmware, no transmit capability. I'm not careless. I logged this decision at 14.09. I logged my reasoning, and I logged the fact that Veyes had already dismissed the interaction and therefore the decision was operationally mine. The human looked at the slate for a moment, turned it over. Honestly, checked the edges. Then, it sat down cross-legged in the center of the containment cell and started writing. Not frantically, not in a panic. It wrote the way I imagine someone writes letters. Considered, unhurried, occasionally pausing to look at the middle distance before continuing. It had been sedated for the first 4 hours of captivity, which should have left any VEth officer disoriented and nauseous for at least a full cycle. It was writing neatly. I watched it through the viewport for longer than I should have. I told myself I was assessing for communication attempts. I noted in my log that the cell smelled faintly of something I couldn't identify. A warm, organic scent, slightly sharp. Later, for what it's worth, Medic told me it was probably stress hormones metabolizing through the human's skin. Apparently they sweat, their biochemistry, and apparently this is normal for them. I noted this at 14:47, and I did not note that I found it disturbing. Let me give you the context, because you deserve it before things get worse. The human's designation in our system was Capture Subject 7 Gamma. Because the VEth Compact's Intelligence Division names things with all the creativity of a maintenance form. Its actual name, which I found in the documents recovered from its gear, was Adiemi. No rank markings we could identify. No unit insignia that matched anything in our files. Just the name, handwritten on the inside of the equipment case, and a small photograph of what appeared to sort of be two younger humans and one very old human, all making a gesture that looked like showing teeth. The briefing said, probable frontline operative. Captured during the engagement at Relay Station Veth 9. TBH, apprehended mid-mission. Nature of mission unknown. Mid-mission. 9 hours in containment. Mild sedation wearing off. No Allied forces within 40 light minutes. And it was writing. I kept coming back to that word. Mission. And what mission? We'd taken the station, secured every approach corridor, scanned the surrounding debris field twice. There wasn't thing out there. No second operative, no insertion craft, nothing that our sensors could resolve. The human had come in alone on what our tactical analysis classified as a salvage runner, a battered thing that barely survived atmospheric pressure, let alone combat. We'd tracked it in because it was broadcasting a distress signal. Veth standard frequency. Correct encryption prefix. Wrong authentication code. Close enough to make you look. Wrong enough to make you suspicious. Wrong enough, I'd been the one to recommend tractoring it in. I'd logged my reasoning. Unknown vessel on standard distress frequency, potential intelligence value, a low threat profile given hull damage consistent with a vessel that had already been through one serious engagement. I'd written low threat profile. I checked that entry at 15:22 and I sat with it for a while. Log entry, cycle 7, hour 16:51. The human finished writing at approximately 16:40 and held the slate up to the viewport. Not frantically, just held it up, like it was offering me something. I leaned in before I caught myself, and the text was in Veth Standard, which meant it had learned our language at some point, or had a translation system implanted somewhere the medics hadn't found, which was a thought I logged and then sat with for a very uncomfortable 3 minutes. The handwriting was precise and slightly angular, which I've since learned is characteristic of humans who spent their early education writing by hand rather than input interface. It said, I know you're reading my file right now, and you found the authentication code discrepancy 8 hours ago and haven't escalated it yet. You're the careful one. You're also the one who gave me the stylus. I want to talk to whoever made those two decisions, not your commander. You. I stood in that corridor for a long time. The ship look hummed around me. Primary drives at low burn. The specific resonance of the iron meridian's cooling systems that I'd long since stopped hearing consciously, and now only noticed in its absence. The corridor lighting was set to half-cycle dim. Somewhere further down the passage, one of the engineering crew was arguing with someone about a calibration report. The basically human was watching me through the viewport. I logged the time. 16:54, which I basically did not call Veus. I want to be precise here, because precision matters, and also because I've been over this sequence of events many times since. The way you press a bruise, not to hurt yourself exactly, but because you need to confirm it's real. I did not open the containment cell. I opened the comm panel outside it. There's a difference, basically, and the panel allows audio communication into the cell without any physical access. Standard protocol for prisoner interviews, used regularly, requires one officer present and a log entry. I logged it, I guess, plus 17.02. I remember my hand hesitated over the entry field for a moment before I typed routine communication assessment. That wasn't, strictly speaking, accurate. I pressed the comm key. How did you know about the authentication code? I said. My Veth standard came out more formal than I intended. I default to formal register when I'm uncertain, which Veus also finds irritating. The human looked up from where it had returned to writing. It, pretty much, had already turned the slate over and was using the back. It set the TBH stylus down with the small, deliberate motion of someone who has time. Because I put it there, it said. Slightly off. Not enough to abort, enough to flag. It paused. I needed to make sure the careful one caught it. My secondary respiratory membrane did something involuntary at that point. I don't include this in my official log. I am including it here because this account isn't my official log. To what end? I said. To make sure I got the careful one. It looked at me steadily. Its eyes were a dark brown, nearly black in the cell lighting, and they had that particular fixed quality, forward-facing, full binocular, that I'd read about in alien physiology briefs but found a lot more pointed in practice. You've been watching me for 3 hours, which you haven't reported anything. You gave me the stylus. You're the one who recommended tractoring us in. Us. I noted the word at 17.06 and hoped it had been a translation artifact. The distress signal. Well, I said. Correct. You weren't in distress. It did something with its mouth, a small upward curve at the corners. I'd been told this was a positive expression in human facial communication. In context, made the secondary membrane do another involuntary thing. Or we really weren't, it agreed. Log entry, cycle 7, hour 17.34. I should have called Veus at 1707. I should have called Veus at 1719 when the human told me its name was Adeyemi and asked mine, and I gave it. I should have called Veus at 1731 when Adeyemi said, calmly, conversationally, while writing on the second side of the slate, your sensor array on the ventral hull has a 17-second gap in its rotation cycle. It's been logging clean because the gap is during handoff between arrays and the system fills with residual data. You've had it since the Karath engagement, which someone patched it fast and didn't tell you about the patch. I said, how do you know about the Karath engagement? It said, we've been watching you longer than you've been watching us. Then it looked up and its face did the curve thing again, less subtle this time. You should check the ventral array. I'll wait. I checked the ventral array and I found the gap at 17.39. 17 seconds. Exactly as described. The patch log was dated 6 cycles back, filed under routine maintenance, tagged with an authorization code that I did not recognize. I stood in the sensor bay for a while after that. The ship's, cooling system resonated at a frequency I'd always found grounding. A low, steady hum, something my nervous system had long since classified as safe. I focused on it. The hum. Plus, the texture of the console under my hands. The smell of recycled air with its trace of coolant and metal. I went back to the containment corridor at 1802 and I pressed the comm key and I said, what do you want? Not a question. I didn't have the register for questions anymore. Adeyemi sat down pretty much, the stylus. I want you to understand what you've caught, not what you think you've caught. It leaned back against the containment wall, unhurried, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Because there's a difference, and one of those things is a problem for you, and one of them isn't. And you're offering to tell me which is which. I'm offering to tell you what happens next. A pause. You can, do what you want with that. Log entry. Cycle 7, hour 1844. It told me about the salvage runner first. How it worked. Which in the structural sense. The drive configuration, the shielding arrangement, the specific modifications made to the distress beacon system to allow frequency and encryption layering. Pretty much not a battle plan. A tutorial. The kind of thing you tell someone when you want them to understand that what they're looking at isn't what they were told it was. The pretty much runner had not been modified for salvage, it had been modified for insertion. The hull damage I'd read as consistent with a prior engagement was, Adeyemi explained with no particular pride, deliberate. Applied in a pattern that would read to Veth tactical sensors as combat wear rather than tool marks. The atmospheric, honestly, stress fractures on the port nacelle were real. The rest was cosmetics. And we've been placing vessels like that for 3 cycles, it said. Different configurations, different distress frequencies. Look, always slightly off code. We needed to know how long it took each command structure to respond and which officers recommended action rather than dismissal, and whether those officers escalated or held. You were mapping our decision trees. We were finding the careful ones. Another look at me, direct and steady. You're the fourth. TBH, I logged this at 1849. I logged it as prisoner intelligence claim, unverified. I was aware this wasn't an adequate description of what I was experiencing in that moment. There is no field in the standard log template for the slow vertical drop of understanding something you can't ununderstand. 4 ships, I said, plus 4 carriers, 17 escort vessels, 42 relay stations. It said this the way you'd read inventory, not gloating, just accounting. We needed to know the structure before we moved. Moved to do what? Adeyemi looked at me for a moment. Then it picked up the stylus and wrote something on the slate and held it up. Not the right question. Try. What do for what it's worth? You want the ending to look like. The cooling system hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, the engineering argument had resolved into someone laughing, a short, tired sound. I stared at that slate for a long time. I did not call Veus, which, log entry, Cycle 7, hour 21.17. I made 3 calls in the next 2 hours. None of them were to Veus, and the first was to the sensor maintenance officer on a pretense of a calibration audit. I asked, look, with practiced casualness, about the ventral array patch. He pulled the record. The authorization code wasn't in any personnel file he could access. He shrugged. I logged his shrug. The second call, was to Signals Intelligence, where I've a professional contact who owes me a residual favor from the Kerath business. I gave her the authentication code from the distress beacon. Not the captured vessels, a different one I'd matched against records from 2 prior intercepts I'd filed and forgotten, and asked if she recognized the layering pattern. She did not answer for a while. When she did, she said, "Where did you get this?" I said it came from the latest capture. She said she needed to run it up the chain, and I said wait. And then I said, hold, and I did not say anything useful for several seconds. She said, Triv, how many vessels have been using this pattern? I looked at my log, at the 4 entries I'd matched, at the 17 relay station intercepts I'd cross-referenced in the last hour, pulling from archived signals data, looking for the same 3.7% authentication offset that Adeyemi had described like it was a calling card. I need more time, I said. She said, I think I need to escalate this. I said, give me until next cycle. She gave me 6 hours. That was the 3rd call, the one I made to myself at 21:12, standing in the empty sensor bay with the lights at minimum and the hum of the cooling system for company, telling myself that the correct action was to bring this to Veus immediately, that the correct TBH action was to file the full communication log, the ventral array finding, the authentication pattern analysis, all of it, armed through proper channels and let command determine next steps. The correct action. I logged the time, 21:17, and I went back to the containment corridor. Adeyemi was asleep. I stood at the viewport and looked at it for a moment. It had folded the equipment case under its head as a pillow and was lying on its side on the cell floor. Not the bunk, the floor. Which is harder, which makes no sense to me, but I've since read that some humans do this deliberately and apparently find it comfortable, which I don't have a word for what I find it. Its breathing, was slow and regular. I've been in intelligence for 11 cycles. I've interviewed prisoners on 3 continents, of 4 different worlds. And I know what sedated sleep looks like, and what rest looks like, and what the particular controlled stillness of someone feigning sleep looks like. This was rest. Plus, whatever Adeyemi was, whatever was behind those eyes when they were open, whatever machinery had calculated authentication, offset percentages, and sensor rotation gaps, and decision tree mapping across 17 carrier groups, it was, in this moment, simply asleep. On the floor. Plus with its hands loosely curled near its face. I looked at the scar through the left eyebrow. I looked at the photograph they'd taken from its gear and now rested in the evidence tray outside. The 2 younger humans and the old one, showing their teeth in that way. I thought about what it must be. and to map an enemy fleet with this kind of patience and then go to sleep on a containment floor while that enemy fleet processed the fact of you. I thought about basically the word us, which at 21:44 I went back to my station and started pulling the full archive. I did not sleep. Adeyemi had said, "What do you want the ending to look like?" I was beginning to understand that wasn't a philosophical question. It was a timetable. By the time I'd cross-referenced everything I could access, without triggering an audit flag, the number wasn't 4. It was 29. 29 vessels. 29 distress beacons with the same authentication offset, spread across 11 cycles of intercept logs, distributed through 9 carrier groups and 44 relay installations. Most had been dismissed as signal noise, as 6 had been tracked in and the vessels found empty. No crew, no usable intelligence, filed as decoys and archived. 3 had TBH, been flagged anomalous and escalated to Sector Command, where they apparently entered a review process whose current status I couldn't access. I'd found one more thing, which I logged at 03:19 and then stared at for 3 minutes before I could continue. Every single ship had been brought in by an officer who fit a specific profile. Not to be fair, rank. Not species. Not years of service. Profile. The ones who hesitated before escalating. The ones whose logs showed consistent cross-referencing before decisions. The ones actually who had, at some point in their recent record, noticed something and held it quietly before acting on it. The careful ones. Adeyemi had said that. I'd heard it as flattery, or some kind of manipulation play, the sort of thing an operative tells an interviewing officer to build rapport. I'd noted it as such in my log, which tells you something about the distance between what I logged and what I actually believed. I'd cross-referenced 29 cases, 29 careful ones, distributed across the Compact's operational theatre like nodes in a net, like something in a net. Plus, I pressed my secondary membrane flat against my jaw, an involuntary stress response I've had since my 3rd deployment and have never fully controlled. And I went back to the containment corridor and pressed the comm key. Adeyemi was already awake, sitting with the slate, not writing, waiting. 29, I said. That you found? It said, plus not correcting me, just noting the scope of what I was working with. How, in my opinion, many total. A pause. It looked at me with that flat, forward-facing steadiness, and I'd the particular sensation of being assessed by something. That had already finished its assessment and was watching me catch up. More than you need to worry about right now, it said. That, to be fair, isn't an answer. It's the only answer that helps you. It set the slate down. You're about 3 hours from your signals contact filing this upward without you, maybe 2, if she's the cautious kind. Once it goes up, you lose the initiative. Another pause. You know what I'm going to ask. You're going to ask me to open the cell. I'm going to ask you to open the cell. I want to describe, precisely, the state I was in at 03:31 when I stood outside that containment door. Not because I think precision matters here, and I think I owe an honest account. I wasn't afraid exactly. Fear in Veth neurophysiology is a specific cascade. The secondary membrane flush, the step-up D chemical signaling, the particular narrowing of sensory focus that tells your body to prepare a direction. I know what fear feels like, and this wasn't it. This was something that doesn't have a standard entry in the psychological classification guides. The closest concept in Veth, Velthris, translates approximately as the full comprehension of a variable you already know is outside your control. It kind of is the feeling of watching something fall and understanding, in the moment before it lands, the exact nature of the impact. Not fear of the impact, plus not anticipation of it, just the knowing. And I've been in intelligence for 11 cycles. I've made decisions that affected lives, mine and others. I know the shape of a moment that can't be walked back from. I stood at the door and I knew. I, for what it's worth, opened the comm key instead of the door. Tell me what happens if I don't open the cell. Adeyemi was quiet for a moment. You file the report, which Vase takes over. I answer his questions or I don't. Eventually, your sector command will understand the scope of what they're dealing with and escalate to the council. And by then, several months will have passed and the conversation will be happening in a room I'm not in, between people who've had time to get frightened. A pause. Frightened people make fast decisions. And if I do open the cell, the conversation happens now, between us. It looked at me steadily. So you already know enough to be at this table. You worked that out in 3 hours with limited archive access. That's, to be fair, the whole reason the code was calibrated to find you. My membrane pressed flat again. I focused on the door texture. Standard Veth alloy composite, the stamped serial number slightly crooked, which had always faintly bothered me and apparently continued to bother me even now. I'm not authorized to conduct this negotiation, I said. Actually, no, it agreed. But you're the one with all the context. I logged it, like I logged everything. I want to honestly be clear about that. Every decision I made in that corridor was in the record before I made it, framed as accurately as I could frame it, given that some of the framing required vocabulary I am still not sure I've. Adeyemi stood up, not fast, not in the posture of someone seizing an opportunity. Just stood up, stretched in that basically peculiar way that human musculature apparently requires, arms overhead, something in the spine releasing with a sound. That, I noted, was consistent with joint decompression rather than anything threatening, though I logged both observations. Picked up the slate. Thank you, it said, which, do not thank me, I said. I need to understand what you want. Not the framing you've been building toward for 9 hours. What I guess you actually want. It looked at me for a moment. Then it moved past me into the corridor, not toward anything, just out of the cell, and leaned against the opposite wall and looked at the ceiling, the way it had in the cell when it was thinking. We want the relay stations, it said. Look, not destroyed, renegotiated. The deep space infrastructure your compact has been building for 40 cycles. We want access, transit rights, communication bandwidth. We want a seat in the framework instead of a wall around it. You could have opened diplomatic channels. We did. A small, dry quality entered its voice. 7 times. 3 of those approaches were met with what your Foreign Affairs Division classified as hostile contact from unverified species. The other 4 were archived pending review. It looked at me. We've been pending review for 19 cycles. I thought about the 3 escalated vessels in the sector command review process. The current status I couldn't access, so instead I said, you mapped our decision architecture. We needed to understand where the doors were, and honestly, who stood near them. Another look. Even patient, carrying something under the patients that I couldn't read in. Its physiology, because its physiology wasn't mine to read. We're not here, in my opinion, to threaten you. I need you to believe that, because the next part only works if you believe it. You've spent 9 cycles placing operatives across my fleet's operational theater. We've spent 9 cycles placing conversations across your fleet. I'm not a weapon. None you know of the 29 were weapons. It paused. What I am is expensive proof that we can do this as many times as we need to. The corridor hummed. The stamped serial number on the containment door was still crooked. I noted it at 0414 and said nothing for a while. What's the next part? I said, and it showed me the slate. What TBH it had been writing. Or over 9 hours on both sides of the data slate with no network access, wasn't a message. It was a brief. 12 pages, both sides, compact handwriting, the angular script I'd read as personal correspondence, but was in fact a structured policy document. Scope of requested access, proposed bandwidth allocation, draft transit protocols, species identification and biological hazard assessments for 47 human vessels that had apparently been operating in Veth-adjacent space for 11 cycles without our knowledge. A glossary of terms, because several human diplomatic concepts had no Veth equivalent and Adeyemi had written their own. A proposed meeting structure with a suggested list of Veth officers, not political figures. Officers. The careful ones from the 29 cases. Their names, their records, their decision profiles annotated in a handwriting I was going to look at for a long time after this. My name was, I guess, second on the list. Not first, second. There was a note next to my name, in smaller script. Check. Ventral array confirmed. Recommend verification before meeting. I stood there holding that slate, and Adeyemi was watching me with the expression I'd catalogued as the mouth curve. But there was something layered beneath it. Something tired, I thought, or patient in the way of something that has been patient for a very long time, and is near the end of that. You wrote this in the cell, I said, while we were running your identification protocols. I wrote most of it on the way in, it said. I've been working on the glossary for about 2 years. I looked at the glossary, and the first entry, patience, human concept, not a passive state. The active practice of not moving until the correct moment. Closest Veth equivalent, unknown. My secondary membrane was entirely flat. I was aware of this, but had stopped fighting it. You were never for what it's worth in distress, I said. Not even a little. I called my signals contact at 0531 and told her to hold. She said, Triv. I said, I know. She said, I've already got 2 flags on this from sector intelligence asking where the escalation is. Honestly, I said, tell them it's in progress and you're awaiting a full brief from the capturing officer. A pause. You have for what it's worth, something. I've something. Another pause. Longer. She had known me for 9 cycles, and she had a good sense, I'd always thought, or for when I was out past my depth versus when I was standing in something I hadn't fully mapped yet. How long do you need? Until end of cycle. She gave me 4 hours. I did not point out that I'd asked for a full cycle. 4 hours was what she could hold without consequences, and I did not ask her to take consequences that should be mine. I went back to the corridor and told Adeyemi I'd 4 hours. It said, that's enough. I said, for what? It said, for you to decide if you want to be the officer who escalated a weapons threat or the officer who opened a diplomatic channel. It paused. Both are accurate. The first one makes your career. The second one, TBH, might make something else. I did not like that sentence. I noted this at 5:39 and then noted that my not liking it wasn't, in any meaningful sense, an argument against it. We spent 3 of the 4 hours on the glossary. I want honestly to explain why. Because I know how it reads. A Veth intelligence officer, alone with an unescorted prisoner, spending 3 hours on a diplomatic vocabulary document while the fleet around her sits unaware of the nature of what they've pulled aboard. I know how it reads. But the glossary was the document that made me understand the rest of the brief. Not tactically, not strategically. It was the thing that made me understand the species that had written it. Adeyemi had terms for things we did not. Commitment without guarantee. To make a promise when you can't ensure the outcome. Trusting the relationship over the variables. A whole entry for that. 2 paragraphs. Plus, unnecessary stubbornness. The refusal to accept an outcome not because it's tactically incorrect, but because it's wrong. Different from pride. Different from error. The deliberate choice to fail on your own terms rather than succeed on someone else's. There was a term I kept coming back to. Long patience. The human pretty much word was, Adeyemi wrote it phonetically since the translation was approximate, tenacity. Not the word itself, but the definition. To hold on when the rational calculation says release. The belief that enough time, applied to enough resistance, changes the structure of what you're resisting. 19 cycles of failed diplomatic approaches. 29 ships. 11 cycles of placement. 2 years writing a glossary in anticipation of a conversation that had not happened yet. I looked at that slate. No, I looked at Adeyemi, who was sitting on the corridor floor at this point. I'd not offered it a chair, and it had not asked for one, had simply sat down against the wall when we started talking, practical and without ceremony, and who was watching me read with an expression I'd started to be able to identify. Not the mouth curve. Something quieter, which waiting to see if it worked. I called Vayas at 8:51. I told him I'd an update on capture subject 7 Gamma that required his immediate attention and suggested a meeting at 9:30 with Signals Intelligence and Sector Command present. He said, "Threat assessment?" I said, "Complicated." He said, "Is the prisoner secure?" I looked at Adeyemi, who was still on the floor, writing something new on the slate's edges in the tiny space I hadn't filled yet. Honestly, yes, I said. I meant it. Just not in the way Vayas was asking. The meeting happened at 9:30, and I presented the brief, all of it, the authentication offset pattern, the 29 vessels, the decision tree mapping, the policy document. I presented for what it's worth, it with my log, which is a complete record of every choice I made and why. And I want to be clear, I did not present it as the discovery of a threat. I presented it as a contact. Plus, for what it's worth, Vayas was unhappy with me for a while after that. He put it in terms of protocol violation, which is accurate, and unauthorized independent action, which is also accurate, and then he was quiet for a while and he looked at the brief and he's, whatever else Vayas is, not an uncareful officer. And he said, "They built this whole apparatus to find a door to knock on." I said, "Yes." He said, 19 cycles. I said, "Yes." He looked at the glossary. He read the entry for tenacity. He set it down and looked at the ceiling for a while and said nothing. Adeyemi was brought to the meeting room at 10:15. It walked in with the slate and sat down at the table, looked at the assembled officers and did not perform anything. No deference, no aggression, no theatre. Just sat, I think, down and said, "I understand you've questions. I'll answer what I can." I logged the time. I logged Vayas's face, which did something I did not have a word for. I logged the number of people in that room who were about to have their understanding of the last 11 cycles revised. I logged my own name, second on Adeyemi's list. Yes, and the note that said check. Ventral array confirmed? It had been confirmed. I'd, to be fair, been the careful one. Plus, I was beginning to understand that careful had been the whole plan.